Welcome to Ike's Flame. Join us on another Star Wars adventure. Punch it, Chewie. Hey y'all, Ike here, and we're back for another episode of the week of Ike's Flame. And this week I'm super excited. I got a guest on named Andy. He's going to come and talk, and we're going to chat about the spirituality of Star Wars and what all we can. Some a little bit where George Lucas came from. I learned some things from him. That's super interesting. So I hope you guys enjoy episode this week as we dive in. I got my little buddy here, my dog. She says hi as well. But I hope you guys enjoy this conversation with Andy about spirituality and the really interesting aspects that we dig into. And so just enjoy the episode, and we'll be back with you at the end. Alrighty, friends. I got another guest with us today, and I'm super excited to talk and have some good conversation today with Andy, who is joining us. And Andy is he has a Instagram feed, and it is Jedi Library, right? Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. And he does some philosophy stuff on there with quotes and all that stuff. So, and we'll get into that later. But how are you, Andy?
I'm very well, thank you, Isaac, and thanks for inviting me on the show today.
Yeah, my pleasure. One of the things I love about being able to do podcasting and specifically Star Wars is interviewing people and like why people love Star Wars, why does it intrigue you, and all that stuff. And so it's just fun to talk to others that enjoy Star Wars. So that way, this way our listeners can kind of get to know like who you are and that sort of thing. Like, what got you into Star Wars, and what is like that? There's one or two things that you're like, man, I really love this about Star Wars.
Yeah, so I'm going to kind of betray my age a little bit here, but when I was 6 or 7 years old, I was quite ill as a child, and it was kind of undiagnosed. No one knew what it was. But anyway, the doctors kind of signed me off school and said, you can't go to school for a few months. My parents had just bought a VHS player. So this is what's dating me here.
Yeah.
And I don't know, about a month after that, my dad brought home this big old cassette box that the VHS cassettes used to come in.
Yeah.
And it said Star Wars on the front. I think it also had a sticker saying X rental copy. So it kind of tells you where he got it from. He got it from a video cassette rental shop.
Yeah.
But he bought it and he said, look, I think you'll like this. Anyway, the next day I'm like wiped out from what I'm ill with. And I'm on my folks' sofa. I put the cassette in the machine and off I go. And basically that first watch, and I'm completely intoxicated. And it's no exaggeration to say that over the next 6 months or so, aged 7, I think, I probably watched that movie, I mean, at least once a day, quite often twice a day, because it was the only movie we had. And so that, I think, just sort of infiltrated into me at that very impressionable young age.
Yeah.
Then just the way the movies came out, I then saw Return of the Jedi in the cinema.
Okay.
And then kind of a year or two later, Empire came out on the telly, which I recorded on the aforementioned VHS recorder.
Yeah.
And then, of course, for the longest time, it was just those 3 movies.
Yeah.
So got to know those very, very well as a kid. And then some of the books started coming out. So Heir of the Empire series in the early 90s. And we heard rumors that Lucas wanted to do either prequels or follow-on movies, and that there might be 9, but this was all kind of hearsay. But my love for the franchise was those original first 3 movies.
Yeah.
And I guess what's slightly weird, and what I've continued, is that even having watched those movies at a young age, it wasn't Luke Skywalker or Obi-Wan or Darth Vader or Leia, or I wasn't like into the characters very much. It was this notion of the Force that completely intoxicates me. And I'm like, okay, even at that age, I realized that lightsabers probably don't exist, that like faster than light travel, probably not possible.
Yeah.
But what is this thing that they're referring to called the Force? What is that?
Yeah.
Does it bear any resemblance to this sort of early notions of God or religion that you have as a kid? And so
Yeah.
it just started from that little seed and has kind of grown from there. So
Mm.
yeah, 40 years later now, believe it
Yeah.
or not, that has kind of been my side project, irrespective of what I've been doing in school or with work.
Yeah.
That has always been going on in the background. And it kind of got to the point 8 years ago now that I joined up to a website called Temple of the Jedi Order. I don't know if any of your viewers or listeners will have heard of that,
Yeah.
but it's an online kind of society.
Okay.
And I've been involved with that, not in the middle of it, somewhat to the side of it.
Yeah.
But you know, going through what they do there, I've met lots of people there, and that's all been fun. And then basically 2 years ago, I thought actually there might be a broader audience of people who don't necessarily want to join what looks like an institution, because a lot of people have problems with institutions, but they might just want to you know, get some content which is relating to philosophy, some of the spiritual side, even a religious angle, to do with the Star Wars universe. What is the Force? What could a Jedi be in our world here on Earth in the 21st century?
Yeah, yeah. You know, that's a very intriguing question, and and I think we especially as a kid, everyone thinks about hey, what would it be like if the Jedi was here, and how would we, and and then you can go into the everything that would go into that with philosophy and the things behind it, and I think it's just so interesting. You mentioned kind of the prequels, and I know we get into the sequels and the TV series. Have you kept up with all that, and what do you think? Do you like it? Is there some stuff you like, some stuff you don't like?
Yes, so I found the Phantom Menace tricky because I guess I was 23, 24 years old.
Okay.
And it was still kind of a kid's movie, so I enjoyed it, but I was definitely of that generation who somehow wanted to rekindle their youth when that just wasn't possible. A movie really cannot do that. And I think you know, the press it got at the time was way too harsh. It's a fine movie, and I now have friends in the community that was their equivalent of A New Hope for me, and they love it as much as A New Hope as I love A New Hope. I totally respect that. So I enjoyed the prequels, and then the sequels obviously have come out more recently, and I was fine with The Force Awakens. From my perspective, I thought The Last Jedi got a huge amount correct, which I totally respect. Maybe a contentious opinion.
Yeah.
And then Last Skywalker, there were some things that I found tricky, but again, there was plenty they got right as well. So yeah, definitely all the movies. I love Rogue One. I love Solo. So those additional ones. And then I was slow with the Clone Wars. So I actually watched Rebels first and then thought, okay, I'm really going to understand what's going on here. I need to watch the Clone Wars. So I then did that. And then what have we had since then? Mando, Obi, and Ahsoka. And in fact, my dog, who isn't in the room at the moment, she's 10, nearly 11 years old now, and she's called Ahsoka. So I was a huge Ahsoka fan, you know, 4, 10 or 11 years ago. So that was a long answer to what's quite a short answer could have been. I've consumed all of it. I'm still a fan, but I also look at it with this eye of thinking, okay, I thought that explanation for this part of it was awesome. I then think, well, that one, I wish I could talk to the writers sometimes to give them a little extra spin, but that's just me wanting to stick my nose in. I think they've generally done a pretty good job.
Yeah, definitely. I would agree. I'm a prequels era kid, so I get that's what I grew up with. So for me, and I think for me it's those are good movies, but they are all, for me it's more of a nostalgia thing, and so I enjoy that, especially out of the nostalgia and that sort of thing. And I would agree with you. I think like The Last Jedi, I think the more I've watched it, and more I've watched the sequels, the more I have enjoyed them and felt less maybe betrayed by what Disney has done, and kind of understand that. So yeah, I get you there. I think I said like I feel like the more I've watched them, the more I kind of like okay, I see what they're doing or what at least even what they were trying to do. If I'm not completely on board with it, and so yeah, definitely. So yeah, so let's transition kind of our conversation. What I kind of want to talk about for the bulk of our time is and this is what you do on a lot of times on your Instagram Jedi Library. At least you print out quotes and different things and talk about philosophy with Star Wars. So, what's that look like for you? Like, just dive into kind of the philosophy side, and how your brain works through that,
Yeah, no,
and what that
absolutely.
looks like.
Yeah, so I'd say the platform I probably put most stuff out is on YouTube, and I'm trying to
Okay,
build up
YouTube.
the Instagram to
Yeah,
kind of fill in some of the gaps there.
awesome. Yeah.
So what I did, I mean, must be late 90s, possibly 97, 98, in the
Yeah.
early days of forums on the internet. There were people talking about Star Wars and philosophy,
Yeah.
and I saw this thing saying that George Lucas had based his ideas on the Force, the light and the dark, and so on from Taoism. So I'm like, I've never heard of Taoism
Yeah,
before.
yeah.
What's this? But in the early days of the internet, even then, you could still look this stuff up. And I very quickly saw that Taoism was linked to an ancient wisdom text called the Tao Te Ching. So I'm like, okay, if this is what inspired the thing that I'm most interested in Star Wars about, I should probably investigate that.
Yeah.
So I printed it off and read it, and I was just completely blown away. I was like, how can this have been written 2,500 years ago in China? It has so much relevance. It has so much wisdom in it. And it connected with me in a way that I had not felt connected to a philosophy or a religion in any sense before.
Yeah.
So that set me really off down this path. It gave me something tangible to answer that question I had as a 7 or 8-year-old.
Yeah.
Is there any relevance to this in real life, in inverted commas? So I researched a huge amount of Taoism on the back of that. And we can go into some of the things there, but they're very relevant to Luke's career arc, particularly in The Force Awakens and The Last Jedi. There are some things which are not Taoist about him at all, but there are a lot of things which really are. So they kind of continued that a little bit. But through Taoism, I then came across the work of Alan Watts. And Alan Watts is now all over YouTube if your algorithm is tuned.
Yeah.
And he was a British guy, went to California in the 1950s, had been a Church of England minister, but then began to study particularly the Hindu and Buddhist and Taoist texts. So those sort of East Asian religions primarily, and was giving talks around California and the States through the 1960s and early 70s. And that fortunately they recorded a lot of his talks. Now, in that, he refers frequently to this notion of the perennial philosophy. And the perennial philosophy is this idea that irrespective of where people are in the world or when they have lived, you can have an overwhelming kind of enlightenment experience. And it's not necessarily long-lived. This is not to say you are enlightened or anything like that. But they have certain features that, as I say, occur very consistently across time and culture and space. And this is a feeling of complete loss of self, loss of ego, a complete connection with absolutely everything. This kind of weird feeling that everything is kind of happening exactly as it should be, even if it can feel like sometimes everything is going down the plug hole and going bad, that there's a sort of reason for that. And there are various other factors, but that's the sort of experience of that. But people began in the 19th century when they had enough access and translations of all these different wisdom texts to then begin to draw out the commonalities.
Yeah.
What is common to Christianity? What is common to Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, Taoism, Confucianism, Zen, even some of the more pagan orientated religions, all the various shaman traditions and so on. This culminated for me, and this turns out it was a huge influence on Alan Watts, in a book written by Aldous Huxley. Now, you probably know Aldous Huxley through Brave New World, which has been a very popular fictional book about the concerns, problems regarding totalitarian regimes. He also wrote a very famous book called The Doors of Perception about tripping on mescaline. But bookmarked between those very, very two different books is his book called The Perennial Philosophy. And this is obviously 50 years before the internet he wrote this. The level of scholarship and the breadth of sources he has in that book is just extraordinary. And the way he draws it all together into sort of 25 different chapters, all with different kind of headings. It's not like someone saying they're just being spiritual and kind of cherry picking the bits that they like from different religions. It's saying, okay, this is common across all of them, and we love to focus on difference, and we love to focus on the arguments between different wisdom traditions, but there is just a vast amount that is extremely consistent. And so I've begun to draw that out, been influenced by a lot of the different philosophical ideas into my own conception of what we could call the Force, but has been known by so many names, by so many different people through history, but they are still referring to the same thing.
Yeah.
The absolute, the set of all sets, the ground of being. People have come up with so many different names. And I think it's completely justified for Star Wars fans or anyone who's been heavily influenced by that work to say, this is exactly what they were getting at with the Force.
Yeah, definitely. And as you were talking there, I just think of like, because I think Star Wars for so many people is, it's very captivating. There's something that about Star Wars that kind of pulls at your heart, that and a lot of good storytelling arcs and things. But I think also with the Force, like we are, I mean, in my beliefs and as a Christian, but also I know a lot of other people, it's whatever religion, or even if you're not necessarily religious to a specific religion, it is like we have to have this spirit. We're spiritual beings, and like
Correct.
that it really pulls at who we are. And so I think that's like one thing about Star Wars that I just have found really interesting, and it's been cool to see like different people that have that pull and feeling that. And like as you were talking about that, it's like how even George Lucas, as he was creating this, had this in the back of his mind. It's just interesting to see even the background to maybe where the Force came from in George's mind, as we get this thing on the screen as movies and things. And then that's why I at least for me, what part of the reason it hits home so much, and the reason I love Star Wars is because of that.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think, as is pretty well documented, he was a student of Joseph Campbell. So the hero's journey narrative is, there's no better exponent than Star Wars for the sort of archetypal example of what the hero's journey involves. And then when you actually read Joseph Campbell, it kind of makes even more and more sense. You know, his view that this meta myth, this hero's journey of an arc of kind of narrative that leads to some sort of realization, some sort of going to a different place, learning something new, facing challenges, turning down the call to adventure, all these different segments. We can apply those to our lives, even if it's just something as simple as I don't know, getting up half an hour earlier in the morning, or
Yeah.
changing our diet to something a bit more healthy. It can be something as relatively small as that, or
Yeah.
it can also map onto the whole trajectory of our lives as well. But what Joseph Campbell ultimately says is that myth is kind of represented. Yes, they are engaging stories and they have meaning to us because they do represent what our lives can be like. But ultimately, myth and the characters of myth are kind of misread as stories. They talk to fundamental psychological truths in human beings,
Yeah.
which don't seem to change over time or with culture or with anything else. These seem to be very intrinsic to what it means to be a human being, which is why I think the Star Wars movies speak to us so well. Yes,
Yeah.
they're well made and they're engaging stories and they look great and the music's fantastic, but fundamentally it's those things that really draw us in, and where we can genuinely learn something directly from the movies, or as I've done, use it as a springboard to then go and investigate the influences.
Yeah.
And I mean, my goodness, I feel so privileged to live in 2024 when literally on my phone in my pocket I have access to all the wisdom that has ever been put down on
Yeah.
paper.
Yeah.
Now, how you pass that out, how you make sense of that, maybe becomes increasingly difficult. It can be
Yeah.
almost like information overload.
Yeah.
But to have that there and have access to that and to be able to work with that, it's just, I find that a huge privilege that sometimes we too easily overlook.
Yeah, definitely. I think we can definitely take those things for granted. The resources and things we have access to, um, and yeah, definitely. I think another thing you mentioned a little bit before too is like the fact that like you mentioned like this wisdom literature, this text that goes into Taoism and these other areas that um, had this influence on what Star Wars ended up being, and the Force specifically, but is like is and kind of going back to us as like humans and why we relate to that and all that is the fact that like these texts are thousands of years old, and I mean some of them vary and how old they are exactly, but we like these were concepts and ideas that humans were talking about and thinking about in ancient Greece and ancient Rome and ancient Egyptian times and even back before that. Like, and so it's just I find that it's just interesting that those types of concepts. Hey, like this isn't new. Like these ideas aren't new, but it's put in a new format in the 20th century and 21st century that we are intaking. And so I just find that so very intriguing, and kind of gives me even more of a respect for what George did with Star Wars and where he pulled everything from, knowing that there's a lot of history behind what he was going for, and I find that super intriguing as you were talking about that.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I guess Star Wars could have happened anywhere at any time, but to be in Northern California, grow up in that area in the late
Mm-hmm.
60s and early
Yeah.
70s, as George did, he was in the right place. That was like the cutting edge of where this comparative kind of spirituality was coalescing.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's kind of no coincidence that it came out there and then, but it must have taken a massive leap. No one had ever tried to introduce anything like
Mm-hmm.
this into anything else.
Yeah.
It was kind
Yeah.
of mad.
Hey y'all, I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. I hope you guys got a lot out of this. And I'm going to say here at the end, like, and I believe Andy and I portrayed this well, but like, regardless of your guys' religion, your background, your beliefs, uh, we just really want to respect that. And so I hope we did that well. I hope we just opened up the conversation for that. And I hope you guys learned and just enjoyed our conversation, the first part of this interview with Andy. And come back next week, or at the end of the week here on Friday, and catch the rest of this episode and just enjoy that. light the fire.